Hey, folks, welcome to another edition of Broken Brains with your host, Bruce Parkman, sponsored by the Mac Parkman Foundation, where we look at the issue of repetitive brain trauma from two aspects. Number one, repetitive head impacts from contact sports. Number two, repetitive blast exposure from our military veterans, and what these conditions are doing not only to the brains, but to the mental health and well-being of our veterans, athletes, and children. And why is this important? Because the connection between repetitive brain trauma and brain damage and mental illness is not taught in any medical, nursing, psychological, or suicide prevention program in this country, which means you become the front line of defense for those that you love and those that you know may be suffering. So on the show, we bring in experts and researchers and scientists and doctors and authors and veterans and players and all kinds of folks so that you get that 360-degree perspective on this issue so you can protect those that you love. On the show today, an amazing guest. We've been trying to get this gentleman on for months now, but he's a busy man, Mr. Frank Larkin. Mr. Frank Larkin is a national leader in veteran suicide prevention and traumatic brain injury advocacy. A former Navy SEAL, he currently serves on the board of Boulder Crest and partners with multiple organizations dedicated to improving the health and resilience of veterans and first responders. Frank previously served as the 40th Sergeant at Arms of the United States Senate, overseeing Senate security operations and a 2,200-member U.S. Capitol Police Force. He also spent nearly 15 years in the senior executive service, leading the Department of Defense's Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, JIDO, is a lot easier to say that, and the Counter IED Operations Intel Center, the COIC, which I had the pleasure of working with and for in my early stint as a CEO of a company. A 20-year veteran of the U.S. Secret Service, Frank held senior roles in criminal investigations, presidential protection, and technology innovation, retiring as the Deputy Assistant Director for Protective Research and Chief Technology Officer. In the private sector, he has held leadership positions with SAP, National Security Services, Raytheon, and Lockheed to support national security, defense, and intelligence initiatives. Before entering the federal service, if that was not enough, Frank was also a Navy SEAL, a patrol officer, and a homicide detective in Pennsylvania and Maryland State, and a Maryland State Trooper flight paramedic. He continues to serve his community as a volunteer firefighter paramedic in Annapolis and has been a nationally licensed paramedic for over 40 years. And he holds a BA in criminal justice, an MS in public administration, and we could go on, and numerous awards as a Navy SEAL and as a dedicated civilian servant to this country. Frank, welcome to the show, sir. How you been?
Man, I tell you made my brain hurt with that one.
That sounded great, dude. And that's the short bio.
Yeah.
You've been busy, man. No doubt
Couldn't hold
about
a job,
it.
you know. It just kept moving from one thing to another. Hey, I don't need to explain to you, life is one big adventure. You just got to keep, adding chapters to it. So,
Amen. Yeah, add chapters and taking on what God throws at us, man. So now all good, bro. So, look, I don't even know where to start, but let's talk about, obviously you served the community for many years, and you were a public servant. I mean, you did amazing things after 9/11 with the COIC and JIDO, no doubt about it. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then tell us how you transition into the area of brain health and mental illness here, supporting our veteran.
first of all, thanks for having me on. Obviously, you and I have been in the trenches, kind of trying to slay these dragons for a long time, and we'll get into, why. But, 9/11 was a hallmark event for many of us. It caused a radical shift in the direction of this nation, and certainly exposed our flank, so to speak. We had a lot of vulnerabilities that we weren't paying attention to, and subsequently, we had to jump on it pretty quick to ensure that, you know, it didn't hit the homeland again. And that's, as I look across you know, the, our society, there are a lot of men and women who just dropped everything and stepped up on the line and raised their right hand to make sure the sole purpose of this can't happen here ever again. And, they They put the uniform on and they went forward into harm's way to make sure that the evil that was trying to take our society down, you know, was stopped and effectively held back, paralyzed in what they were trying to do, which they're still trying to do. And that's the big thing right now, is that our American society, we have short memories. Um, and this is why, when we talk about 9/11, we're constantly in the same breath saying, never forget. And you hear that echoed by those that went through Pearl Harbor and some of the other major catastrophes that this nation has faced and endured. But hey, got me into, I was up in New York on 9/11, probably should have been dead about 5 times that day. My office was in the World Trade Center.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Wow.
got destroyed, along with, it was just an incredible, undefinable day. I mean, up until that point, I'd had a lot of experience dealing with emergency situations, coming out of special ops, getting into law enforcement, national security events, so forth. But I'll tell you what, that went to the top of my list. I mean, when you essentially witness 3,000 people, almost 3,000 people just perish around you, and then, you're trying to navigate that day with, kind of relying on a lot of your experience and knowledge from, things that you've been, involved with before. It was a day that, I got to brief the president a couple days later when he came to ground zero. And I told him, I said, life and death was measured simply whether you stepped right or left at any given second. And so I became part of that recovery operation, and up until December 7th of 2001. And I was pulled back to the White House to take over security operations for the Secret Service. As you remember, and as everyone does, because you asked that question, hey, where were you on 9/11? They don't even hesitate. They have an instant recall of where they were, what they were doing, and the impact that it's had on them. And just like yourself and our teammates, everybody rucked up and leaned forward to get into it, because that's what we do. We go, we're about solving problems. And the last thing you want to do is poke us, because, you're going to get something more than you ever asked for. So I got involved. I finished out my career with the Secret Service, which became a very high intensity period for us post 9/11, influenced a lot of changes at the White House during that time. But then I stepped out, retired, and then got pulled back into the Department of Defense to work the IED problem set. And I remember General Monty Meigs. He was a big brain guy. He had taken the baton pass from General Joe Botel, who had stood up the task force when basically our department leadership, the president said, hey, this IED problem is paralyzing us. It's what's bringing all our troopers home in caskets. It's what's maiming them. It's what's causing these horrific injuries. We've got to get on top of this. We got caught with our pants down.
Mhm.
Essentially, we lost all the lessons of the past and got caught with our pants down. And so the task force was to focus on the IED problem. They initially went after the low-hanging fruit of up-armoring vehicles, trying to design new vehicles that could withstand these, improvised explosive devices, also putting sensors out, robots, you name it, a lot of technology, marshaling the brain power of academia, industry, kind of lean in all this. My side of that was the manhunting side, where, I said to Monty Meigs and some of these other leaders, why me? And they said, well, we need somebody that thinks about this differently. I had a background in organized crime, financial crime, going after human networks. And they recognized that, hey, the technology piece of this is just one part, but we really need to go after the human factors. And we have to hunt the networks. We have to map them out. We have to start, touching them in places where they don't expect it. And so that's when my relationship initially with the conventional forces became very tight in deploying my operatives, forward to embed with the operations and intel bubbas who were on the edge, working in the last tactical mile to try to see how we could help without being at that burr in the saddle that usually, the guys up front say, WTF, these guys in the back, they go home every night, they
Mhm.
get a warm cot to sleep in. They got mama to hug up against. They're getting, 3 or 4 good meals. What do they know about what we're dealing with? And
Right.
that's really why we push people forward to embed, and it got a rotation going so we could understand, intimately the challenges of their fight. Not to come in as the know-it-alls, but to say, "Hey, where can we be reinforcing fires to help with, your information gathering, with your analysis, with your operational planning, and so forth." And, once that relationship, and it all came down to relationships and trust and confidence, the magic started to happen. I put operators with analysts, with technologists who on the fly were building this stuff in flight and giving stuff to the operators forward that they weren't even asking for. Just pushing stuff. And they could pick and choose what they wanted. And we started seeing that we were starting to turn the tables on the bombing networks, on the extremist networks, and starting to push them up against the ropes. It was a non-traditional approach. We drew a lot of attention. Jaido at the time had a multi-billion-dollar, stack of cash to throw at the problem to try to bust through the parochial bureaucracies that were just too slow for the warfighter.
Mhm.
And so in that time, I was able not only to initially support the conventional forces, but we got into supporting special operations. So as they went out, and the cycle of operations was just unprecedented, as they went out and hit targets and exploited sensitive information on those targets in order to develop new targets. We got involved in that. A lot of it was IED related. We started doing a lot of dumpster diving. That's a term from my police days.
Haven't heard
You
that
know,
in a while.
yeah, yeah. I remember going into some of these units, SF units, going, to some of our tier one units and so forth, and saying, "Hey, what are you doing with all this crap that's laying on the floor?" Because they were looking for specific information. They wanted the next target. They wanted the next individual to go hunt down. I wanted the stuff that was on the floor. And because I had the computing power, I had the analysts, I had seasoned operators that could look at this stuff and make sense of it. That's where we were started mining a lot of the gold, a lot of the ore, and pushing it forward back to these elements that then took it, or a final stage of planning and execution, which again, I think for me, I jumped out of bed every day to get into work. And so did my team, and the relationship that we built with the operations forward was just, I think, unprecedented. And you knew you were in a sweet spot when those battle commanders would fight you when you had to do a rotation with some of your people. They would fight you not to take their person away from them, because they had built a level of trust. And we soon proved to them that we were going to send them the best that we had, not our mediocre folks, and we didn't have too many mediocre folks because they self-selected out, too tough for them. So the folks that went forward were pretty high speed. And traditionally, it's interesting. Some of them were high speed operators, gotten out of uniform, were now kind of, in more of a civilian support role, while others had never been in uniform, but they were just looking at this problem through a different lens, and showed, tremendous value in, their, being able to apply their technical expertise, their analytical, acumen and so forth to a problem that, as I said earlier, was the source of flag draped caskets and severely wounded coming home, you know, back to the States with just these undefinable, uh, comprehensible wounds. That was the kind of the Jaido phase until I left the organization in 2013, 2014, and then moved on to the next adventure.
Good on you, sir. Yeah, I mean, I remember back in the day, one of my first contracts, I ended up installing those crazy jammers that look like the things on the Humvee that they use for fording rivers. We created
Yeah,
those. Nah, then I ended up supporting JIDO with some really unique network targeting stuff on some really highly classified uh, IEDs. I mean, it was an amazing time to see the country, and the equivalent right now is drones. Right now, we're in the same
yeah,
position.
yeah,
we got our pants down right now. How do we address this drone track? So I think that, we'd probably see something like a JIADO kind of task force get created. So you did all this great stuff. I mean, honestly, I mean, that was a testimony to who you are, plus everything else you've been doing. But how did you get involved with, veteran brain health, all the stuff that you and I talk about right now?
Yeah. So, after JIDO, I did about 4 years up on Capitol Hill as a sergeant at arms, which gave me a kind of a good peek into Congress and how things get done up there. I was an outsider. I definitely, I knew right from the beginning, I was not one of them, so to speak. It was kind of an out of body experience, but very, very instructive. A lot of great people up there doing, trying to do good things. But as we're seeing right now, this is an unvarnished comment. I mean, it's kind of the institution's broken. They're not getting anything done.
Mm.
And it's a shame because the nation needs them right now, needs them to come to center line. It's not, far right. It's not far left. It's about, hey, what do you need to do to accomplish the nation's business? And that's what we got to get back to. But it was a good period. While I was up there, um, my son had, following 9/11, um, he witnessed all that unfold from a hillside west of New York City where we lived. Um, and there's a lot more background to that story, but he was one of the ones that stepped up on the line, raised his hand, and said, I'm going to be part of the solution. This can never happen again. Uh, Came home a year after graduating high school. I kind of gave him, the warning order. Hey, got it, dude. You graduated high school, but you got a year to figure this out, and then you're out. And kind of that tough love. And so he
Yeah.
he was, he was doing all kinds of things. I mean, he wasn't sitting around on his ass. He was doing stuff. He was probably the most significant thing he was doing. He was a salvage diver in the Annapolis, Chesapeake Bay area, working year round. Uh, you
Wow.
know, dr- dropping into the cold water, doing scrubbing the bottom of rich people's boats and stuff like that.
It's
He
JOB.
was. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. He was so. He came home not quite a year out of high school and said, hey, I just enlisted in the Navy. By the way, I volunteered for the SEAL program. And, I never pushed him in this direction. But, as you know, with our boys, our girls, you got to let them, you know,
What do you know?
got to let them cut their own path.
Yeah.
And the worst thing we can do is interfere. We can give them sage advice and try to give them some counsel. But the bottom line is they got to walk that path. And if they trip and fall and, bust their nose in the process, you don't want to see them get hurt. But in many ways, that's kind of what helps to, them figure it out, so to
To grow.
speak.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so, he made it through SEAL training. Again, some
No small
backstory on
achievement.
that. Yeah, no small achievement. He broke his back in Hell Week, got through Hell Week, had a bunch of stress fractures and all. The day that he finished Hell Week, wound up on the beach for about 3 months while he healed up, and then reclassed, with another class, and then went through and got his tried and became a SOCM special operations medic. Went down to Fort Bragg,
Smart
great school
guy.
down there. Yeah,
Yep.
I, you know, yeah, I had a little taste of that back in my young days, but the school was just second to none.
Yeah.
And then
Did it.
immediately deployed to Iraq, where he was right into the mix as soon as he got there. Came home from that pump. I went back maybe a year later to northern Iraq on an HVI mission in support of a Army Tier 1 unit. And which was kind of unusual to see a bunch of frogmen kind of snapped into a unit like that. But again, it's all about relationships. And once they realize they can trust you and you can do the job and so forth, it all comes together. And a great experience for him. He loved working with them. And an alert came out that they were looking for a medic in Afghanistan. They had a guy, one of the medics went down. They needed somebody seasoned. He had a great reputation. He raised his hand. He was single. He was living with a gal for about 4 years, but single. So he had the maneuverability. And he said, look, I'll do it. I'll jump. So came home, reset over the course of 2 weeks, and I went to Afghanistan. And while I was home, I told him, I said, you know, Iraq and Afghanistan are not the same. If you're going in there, Bruce, this. You've had these discussions with these folks. They immediately assume that, hey, I got it on in Iraq. You know,
Combat's combat. Yeah.
yeah, Afghanistan's gonna be, a walk in the park, and they got there and found out, "Ooh, boy, this we're 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 not even on the same in the same, you know, galaxy." I mean, it was like stepping back into time, Stone Ages, and the terrain was much more unforgiving and different dynamics and than Iraq. But certainly a great learning experience for a lot of these operators and units that were deployed in. So he did his time there, came back home, reset. And in between these, as you know, especially SF kind of following in between these major deployments, you're also doing these little training exercises. You're launching to different countries, you're bumping up against their military, you're trying to share some of your knowledge and expertise, especially in Central and South America, Africa, and so forth. So he was doing that and then
And
went
you're
for his
training.
final.
And,
Yeah.
and you're still training to get ready for the next go around.
Hell yeah, yeah, and still get and the one thing, and this is probably a good point to bring this up and pile on, but you train like you fight. So you think people automatically that don't understand this world think, well, you're in training, so what the hell can happen in training? We lose a lot of people in training because
We
we're
do.
pushing the envelope. We're trying to make it as realistic as possible, and not that we're trying to get people hurt, but it does happen because of that. So he's training up and goes for his final pump in Afghanistan into the Helmand Valley, which is where most of the opium productions, taking place. And the Taliban is very protective of that. That's their main source of money.
Buckets, yeah.
The biggest high return. It's also the highest volume of IEDs. And this was back in the I want to say 2011, 12, 13 timeframe when the pressure plates were really, just, you know, it was the ability of the enemy to put these IEDs out was just unbelievable. And, they could build an ID for a pressure plate IED for $5 to $10, put it in the ground and, hooked up to a little transistor radio battery and let it go. And
Hmm.
and at some point, somebody would come along and step on it, and you know, and it wasn't just our warriors; it was the locals that would step on them. It was livestock that would step on them, but they had a horrific effect. He came home from that, and at that time, I'm at Giaido, and I'm just holding my breath. I know where he is. I tried to discipline myself not to read their daily reports.
You got oversight over everything that's going on downrange.
Well, yeah, and then I got my dudes down there and dudettes that are, thinking that they're helping me out by sending me little messages back. Yeah, I saw, your son, he's doing all right. Their unit is doing this, doing that. So anyway, he comes back from that and winds up getting assigned as the senior instructor for the what they call Special Operations Urban Combat. And so getting the other platoons ready to deploy globally into their missions. So it's, used to be called close quarter battle, a number of, urban combat, all that stuff. And I'm not sure what SF calls it.
We called it SFAUC, Special Forces Advanced Urban Combat. It's what we called it. Then our high-end course was SFARTEC. That's where, I went when I was assigned to the SIF. So that was our close quarter combat elite school.
And Bruce, when you're in that environment as an instructor, as an Overwatch, and they're not putting anybody in those positions. They're putting seasoned people that have a reputation for getting up and close and dirty with the problem, being able to bring back that knowledge so that you can move these folks forward with a level of capability and competency. Hopefully something that keeps them alive in that environment. But as you will attest, as you're training these folks, you're constantly being subjected to those forces.
More than anybody else.
Blast. Yeah. Yep. You got concussion grenades, flashbangs, whatever, breaching charges. You're firing rockets. You're dropping mortars. Helicopter operations. You know, and you're falling off of stuff. And in some cases, it's a level of intensity that's even greater than combat. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, a lot of training. I mean, especially for the range safety officer. I mean, you get into a combat engagement. Some of them lasted quite a long time, from what I heard. Not having been in one, but a lot of them were long range firefights, and now you're talking about continuous exposure, because he's the range safety officer. You're going in with team after team after team. They're coming in once. There might be 4 or 5 teams training. They're going around 5 times. You're going around 5 times with them. They're coming in once out of every 5 rounds to that house. So the amount of exposure is, for a range safety officer training that kind of stuff, whether it's AT4s or whatever, is enormous. There's no doubt.
So as Ryan was in this as the lead petty officer and going through all this, exactly what you just described, that's when we started seeing some of the first signs that something wasn't right. Something was kind of moving off center. And so that's kind of an interesting term, moving off center. So where is the center line? So if you're comparing it to normal society, uh, I would say, yeah, we're way off center.
We're way off center when we start.
That's right. Yeah. So it's but and it's part of the problem, because as that that center line moves off the true center, it's hard to be able to kind of tease out who may be having some issues. And very often a lot of the senior folks that are responsible for more of the junior cadre are banged up themselves.
Yes, sir.
And so it's hard for them to say, yeah, that guy's banged up, or maybe it's they see stuff in that person that they also see in themselves, but they don't want to acknowledge that.
Mhm.
And you see a lot of that. So he started having problems with sleep, was probably the first big signal, red flag. And when he would get to sleep, and often with the help of alcohol, which was the easy go-to remedy for not getting sleep, for stress, for pain, because they're all in pain. Every one of them. It's just that they just kind of put it someplace else. But they're in physical pain, they're in moral pain, they're in some cases, spiritual pain. They're all
Emotional pain. Yep.
emotional pain. And so alcohol becomes a big source, over the counter source to try to deal with all of that. And when he would get to sleep, he'd have nightmares, things would come back to, kind of, haunt you, so to speak. Because, we're sending people that, you know, we, and this is the other thing that kind of grabs my ass. World War II, people ask me, what's the difference between World War II and this last 20 years? Well, World War II, the whole freaking nation stood up. I mean, you had a whole society that was engaged in supporting that war effort. And now it's less than 1%. And so there's a lot of folks that don't understand, you know, in many cases, what we're talking about and what a lot of our veterans are dealing with right now from a lot of that experience. We've trained them up to do some pretty extraordinary things, and then we've sent them places to execute, to accomplish, some pretty tough missions, solve some just, indescribable problems. And to think that they're not going to come back burdened with, some kind of a cause and effect of, what they've seen, what they've done, what they've experienced is, I think, pretty blind on our part as a society. These men and women have, as I said, stood up on the line, went forward to protect this nation. Now they're coming home dragging, some pretty heavy burdens. So
And
he,
look, Frank, at the different, you compare World War II, where we had an army fighting an army, combatants fighting
yeah,
combatants. Vietnam kind of blurred that line. Afghanistan, Iraq took this to a whole nother galaxy, as you stated, where you got women and children and being coerced, but you couldn't trust anybody, not to mention the IEDs that would come out of anywhere. I mean, the amount of and then just the confusion, right? Just the complexity of fighting these types of wars morally is almost impossible when you are out there trying to stay alive and complete the mission. And we put our men and women in some very, very difficult situations from a moral perspective, and they had to get the job done. and they did it. And so, whatever has to happen out there to bring our boys and girls back, of course, has to happen. But at the same time, those environments, those decisions that you have to make, to your point, come back with them. And there's no easy way to process this when you are, an American you're not a bad person, right? You signed a dotted line. You have to make decisions. You have to execute operations that really nobody else is trained. You're not even trained for these things, right? You're trained to go out there and kill somebody with a rifle. Now you're navigating, dude. I mean, it's just, yeah. To your point, the complexity of these types of wars is very demanding on the psyche and then the natural pure or the moral implications. I mean, we got moral people going to war to an immoral war, a war that I would say is fought immorally by the other side, pushing us into these situations.
Yeah, I hope your listeners are kind of picking up on what you just said. I mean, you're spot on. And then they come back to a society that's very judgmental.
Ha!
You know, they
Zero defect. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and they expect you to kinda, proceed like you're on Main Street USA, and, what used to grab me is, they'd hook into, one of these terrorists that, were, just killed a bunch of our folks, had this 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 dude had never ever stepped into the United States, and they're reading him his rights. I'm like, "What? What do you mean you're reading him his rights?"
What rights?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and, to your point, especially, in the warrior, ecosystem that we live in and the folks are living in now. I mean, how many times, especially when the special ops arena, you know, you got you got the mission and, your leadership that had confidence in you said, you say, okay, yeah, how do you want us to go about this? And you know what? More times than not, they look you right back in the eye and they say, "Go figure it out.
Amen.
Figure it out." Because it goes back to your point. Hey, we were in a whole new place, and there was no doctrine. Stuff was changing faster than it got into print. That was part of the challenge that we
They
had
were
with
writing doctrine as
giant.
they went. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were not big army against big army anymore, and all the lines got blurred. So there was this whole thing about moral injury and just the degree of confusion, tension, just the conflict that people came home with is real,
It
and
is
it's an
real.
injury. It's an injury, and so as we get into talking about the next phase, which I'm sure here that we're going to evolve in, please keep this whole moral injury piece as part of the calculus of what we're going to be talking about here.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there's no doubt that a lot of the impact on our veteran population, especially from the we'll just say the mental illness part of this is not just that we have a damaged brain, but now we're not capable of processing, the actions that we had to conduct in order to deal morally with an immoral situation. And then it could, of course, and sometimes with our hands cut, commanders wanting to make, decisions on the battlefield and all this stuff instead of trusting men and women to do the right thing. There was a whole bunch of confusion there, as you said, because our doctrine, our moral approach to war was not adequate to take on these folks at the time. We had to meet them at a very primal mode in order to get this job done. And they're the ones that they're the ones that pushed the limit. We didn't. We went in and I guess, and I will say right now, we fought both those wars as morally as possible. Whether, and my problem, I don't, whether they're justified or not, we still went. And we did the best, we did a damn good job. And we did it as more, you could not fight those wars any more morally than how we did it. But I think it also severely impacted our forces' ability to execute operations the way they should have.
Yeah, yeah, and so as we look as I looked at Ryan, after he finished the fourth heavy deployment and then was into this whole SALC urban combat training mission, started to see more and more signs of anxiety. He became short fused. He was one of these guys that he didn't talk a lot, but when he said something, people listened.
Mhm.
But he was also a little bit of a prankster too. He smiled a lot. He had the biggest shit-eating grin
He's your son.
that he would walk around with, but he stopped smiling. And that was a significant sign. His relationship with his significant other, blew apart. He became, more and more isolated, more of them against us, hypervigilant. You could see degrees of paranoia kind of starting to, and this was all uncharacteristic of him. And so eventually, we figured out something was going on. They immediately tagged him with, PTSD. They started putting him on all these freaking drugs, stabilizers. He went to NICO, which is the National Intrepid Center of Excellence in Bethesda, to kind of do a tooth to tail assessment of what may be going on. They came out with a provisional diagnosis of PTSD, depression, all things that were not him. But now, you know, was him. And so, as time went on, he got to a point where he felt that he was becoming more of a liability and asked to come out of the SALC position. He was afraid that, and the worst thing that any operator, the thing that haunts every operator is, I can't let my teammates down. I don't want to fail them. I don't want to be viewed as not carrying my load. I don't want to, these are all real. And so, they spend a lot of energy trying to assess how are my teammates looking back at me, especially when they're struggling with something. And it's exhausting. And so eventually it got to a point where things got pretty bad and he discharged honorably from the teams. He was going to make a career out of it, but things unraveled to the point where he he just couldn't do what he was doing, what he loved to do, and abruptly had to separate from the teams and did not have a clean break, did not have closure with his teammates. He was further burdened by a sense of abandoning them, having you know, not having that. And I'll tell you, this whole segment or issue of separation is really critical. How you separate from service really kind of, in my view, dictates how things are going to go once you leave service. If you're separating because you've got a plan, you've got a place to land, you've got some objectives that you're going to try to accomplish, it's all on a good note, you're going out on the high wave, that's a better trajectory. You're most likely going to have a more successful outcome. But if you're leaving under any type of cloud, if you're being pushed out, if you're leaving because you feel that you can't do the job anymore, that you're banged up, but you don't want to admit it, and you see a lot of that happen, then that sets up more a negative, should I say, kind of a trajectory as to once they get out. Often they don't know where they're headed. They don't have a landing zone identified. Suddenly they've exited this bullet train or this aircraft, and they don't even have a chute
I got a
on.
stepson that just got out of the Army. He's been out for a month. He's already trying to get back in.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah,
is crucial that we separate. And I didn't separate well either, right? I mean, I didn't even have a retirement ceremony. I was not liked from my mouth. And I just came back, turned in my stuff, and I left. And that cost me a lot of, pain. Nothing, I mean, compared to what your son must have been through, struggling emotionally, physically, and then, basically feeling like he didn't even have the support of his brethren when he got separated because whatever was going on. That is a horrible place for our service members to land when they leave the military. It's horrible.
yeah, yeah. And we're calling it, it's kind of a new term, institutional betrayal. Some people may not agree with it.
I think that's a very apt term right there, man. Yeah.
Where you stand up and you give it all to your organization, to the cause, and so forth, and then all of a sudden it turns on you. In Ryan's case, in many cases, they didn't know what they didn't know. So they were trying to do the best they could
That's
for the for the right reason, but all the wrong way because they didn't know. And we'll talk about that shortly. But it goes back to your point when he stepped up to get help and help for his brothers, which was a lot of his motivation about, for why he stepped up. Because I warned him, I said, be careful, bureaucracies tend to shoot the messenger. And
mhm.
so as he was trying to get help, initially it was about the low hanging fruit. They focused on the alcohol, which was not his problem. And they, it, then all of a sudden it turned adversarial. and that's where a segment of his leadership, had a perspective of, hey, I don't need this.
Yeah.
I don't have time to deal with a broken frog man. Get rid of this problem. And that's a signal that I missed, is that when I started seeing the Jags circle up, and accumulating, the data, the evidence, whatever that they needed to kind of, push him towards that departure door. That's, again, he didn't want to leave the teams. He loved what he was doing, but it came to a point where he said, "I gotta go, that, I'm not gonna survive this." And so he left. And their view was, "Hey, it's better for him because the VA will do a better job taking care of him. They'll be able to handle this." So he went, out into VA care, which at the time was a shit show in itself. All that happened there was he got interviewed by people who had no clue what, you know, what he represented, what he had been through, but they were quick to write new prescriptions to keep him chemically sedated so he didn't hurt himself or hurt anybody else. And he bounced through that system for about a year. We were sitting around a fire one night, and it was in the March timeframe of 2017. And he says to me, you know, "Hey, Dad, um, something's wrong with my head." He kept saying this all the time. He says, "Something's wrong with my head, but nobody is listening." And he says, "I'm busted up inside, and I don't think I'm going to live very long. I'm
Wow.
just, And I said, "Hey, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you?" And he said, "No, no, I never go that way. I'll never go that way. But I'm busted up inside. And if anything ever happens to me, I want you to promise to donate my brain to traumatic brain injury research or breacher syndrome research." And I said, "Nothing's going to happen to you. I'm here. I'm your swim buddy. We're going to get through this." And freaking month later, he came home and found that he had taken his life in the basement of our home.
Wow.
He was dressed in a SEAL Team 7 t-shirt, red, white, and blue board shorts, and had illuminated shadow box next to him that had all his medals, ribbons, other insignia that I made for him the holiday before, just to kind of honor his service. I'll tell you, I said earlier, 9/11 like went to the top of my list as far as shitty experiences, but that was quickly replaced by losing him. I had been pretty efficient at packing all my shit away in little compartments. I've seen some pretty horrible things. I was in Africa in the middle of the Tutsi and Hutu wars, back in the 90s. And, at the World Trade Center, I've been to some, as a paramedic, pretty shitty, scenes, horrible scenes. But this just kind of, this cracked, this put some major cracks in my armor. And we, we accomplished his wish. We got him to his brain donated for a research effort at Walter Reed Bethesda, an effort done by Dr. Dan Pearl. He's an internationally renowned neuropathologist. And he came back to us about 2 months later and said, "Hey, Ryan had a severe level of undiagnosed microscopic brain injury uniquely related to blast exposure. We only see it in blast cases. We don't see it's a different injury than the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the CTE that you see in contact sports, which, Bruce, you're very, very familiar with, obviously, with Mac and what we hear about with the NFL and so forth. But this whole new category of blast injury was something that they had not seen before. And the more and more brains that they started to examine, the more they started to see that this was not a one-off. There was something going on here. And because we did not have the imaging technology or the blood markers to see this in a living person, it did not exist. It was not part of the calculus for a clinician that was evaluating somebody that was coming in with problems. And certainly our mental health community did not recognize it because this was a neuroscience, that this was a biological injury It was not a traditional mental health problem that they could score against the DSM-5, diagnostic chart, which is for the most part how they got reimbursed for services, or, it's what they had to put down in the diagnostic block. But this, we started to find out, you know, with a high degree of suspicion, that this level of microscopic injury from blast exposure from our own weapon systems in many cases, not just the IEDs, might have been a key underlying factor, that's contributing to why it's so difficult to deal with some of the veterans and our active warriors that are experiencing problems. And certainly, as we've grown to understand a growing body of evidence connecting it to suicide. So that's what set me on this path. And right now, my high ground is to drive the research, to partner with guys like you and others to get the attention of Congress, to get them off their ass, to get shit done, to put pressure on the Department of Defense, the VA, HHS, to take this seriously, make this a priority, because I truly believe that this is a key factor, especially in the wake of the 20 plus years of persistent conflict that we've just experienced, that may be plaguing our men and women that are struggling every day with a lot of the conditions we just talked about. And I'll get off the transmit button.
Frank, this is, I wanted the audience to hear your path. As dads, right? We share a lot in common here. And because this is just like what my son went through, this is another area where we have failed to, for some reason, associate a common aspect of military life and military training with an outcome of what we were, when we start looking at the suicide epidemic and the mental health pandemic that we have with our military veterans. And it's just amazing to me that, much like CTE, we didn't understand this. I'm a Cold War guy. I did the GBEV calculation that came out at like 1.8 million when, but now we're seeing guys coming out of tier 1 units and the SEALs and SF with 28, 30 something million units of exposure. Why hasn't it taken us so long to understand that? We know that blasts impact the body. Heck, the VA just came out with a blast exposure diagnosis code for the brain last year. They had
Yeah.
one for the colon, for the gut, for the
Yeah.
heart, for the lung. The brain don't count. The most critical organ that we have to stay on this earth doesn't count. Then, not only that, since 2017, or even that's probably when you got going, that we started to understand as a society, I didn't know anything about this, that we have a problem here. Where has the VA been in looking at how we treat this? Because nothing's changed, right? Nothing's changed. Even in the military right now, having been one of, SOCOM's brain advisors for a while, they're just getting a rope on this pony, and they're doing a great job. I mean, they're looking at it, but they're going to impact soldiers for years to come. What about the soldiers now and back when Ryan served, that have had all this blast exposure and that are out there suffering in silence right now, thinking they're crazy? They don't understand they have a brain injury, because what you just explained in terms of the evidentiary path to this is not known, right? This is not just, it's not a well-known phenomena. And so your point about the mission, right, is enormous. I mean, there's so many gaps when it comes to awareness and when it comes to treatment, when it comes to diagnosis right now. And yet you and I know the answers. We know. We know how to validate this. We know how to diagnose this. We've got all kinds of scans that combine with a DD254, and histories and medical records can substantiate we got blast exposure. And you and I know all these treatments that are out there that can help guys, that could have helped your son and could have helped my son had they been available or even knowledgeable. I mean, we would have mortgaged our homes and our lives for our boys. We all know this, right? There's nothing that would have come between us and our sons if we had one chance to save them. But they're available. And yet we cannot get anything going other than, foundational support for the few men and women that understand that, oh my God, my mental health could be tied to my service, could be tied to combat, could be tied to my brain injury.
Yeah, and with the Pentagon right now, we have kind of recast this in a new direction, which I think is more appropriate, and that is, how do we protect and ensure the readiness of the total force? As you said, special operations is leading the way, but this is not about just about special operations. The conventional forces is other supporting entities. So here's my position on this, and whether you agree but this is an existential threat to our national security, and why? What distinguishes us from other armies from around the world, other adversaries and so forth that are trying to hurt us, is that right to the edge, the tip of the spear, it's the thinking warrior brain that has come through time and time again, that has proven that our ability to adapt, to pivot, to innovate, to analyze, to create some level of action and outcome right at the tip of the spear, right at that warrior. In order to do that, your brain's got to be functioning.
Gotta have a brain. Yep.
And if there's something that we're doing to our brains that's deteriorating that ability, then that's no kidding. That's a threat to our national security, let alone to total force readiness and resiliency. That's my position. Right now, they've got some legislation. I know you're working on some. This may be tied to yours, but I guess they're looking in the new NDAA to put a provision in there for the department to look at those cases that had a sense of blast exposure, and as it may have been the motivator or potentially an unknown factor for their discharge.
Love it. Love it. I'll support that 100%. I'd like to know about that piece of legislation because all those BCDs and other honorable discharge that took place, you know, follow the same path that your boy was on, where men and women become unstable. And it's so easy to just get rid of the problem than to try and fix it. And that zero defect military is one of the reasons I retired as a very angry sergeant major in early 2001, is that I continuously railed against a system that was not taking care of our men and women when people were making career decisions instead of military decisions. And where I'm a two-strike guy, you messed the same thing up twice, I'm on you because you didn't learn from the first time. But the first time you can make 1,000 mistakes. I really don't care. You're learning, you're evolving, you're maturing. And we never give our soldiers nowadays the chance to come back from a mistake. And then that's
So true.
compounded when that mistake is caused by a biological injury that is a product and outcome of a dedicated warrior serving his country. And now we've got a huge problem where we're not only letting down the individual, we're setting them on a path to self-destruction because we are failing them morally as leaders. And as an institution, we should be insulating, not isolating, as we used to say when I was a survival expert, when I was a trainer and seer back in the day. We have to insulate our people and take care of them instead of chucking them out there to survive on their own when they have no skills, they have no preparation, and they have a damn brain
Exactly right.
injury, not to include mental illness. So yeah, we have to go back. And not only that, Frank, not only just the BCDs and the OTAs, look at all the suicides that have taken place from men and women that we could go back and look at their blast exposure. How the hell do we address that? And that's why people, I think that's why they're so flat-footed when it comes to this issue is that they don't want to open up this can. And we owe it to these people. We have to open it up. We have to show the moral courage to crack open this can of pain and say, dig into it. And where we failed, we're going to honor it. We're going to admit it. And now we're going to fix it. And we're going to write that check. We're going to make care coverage. We're going to find those men and women that with BCDs and OTHs. And if they were blast related, guess what? You want to join back in or whatever, we're going to fix it. You're going to get a regular R1 code where, you can get your benefits. You can get to the commissary. We're not going to find you under a bridge, and then for the suicides, what can we do for the spouses and the surviving kids when blast exposure even could be, I don't care we're not going to be able to say definitively, but if it could have been a factor, given the fact of what these men and women have left on the ground and in the ground for this country, we owe it to them. And I think, unfortunately, Frank, legislation is about the only way that we're going to get this fixed. And you've been fighting that battle for a while. Where are you seeing Are we close to any wins? I know my legislation I gave to a congressman, I will not mention his name, it didn't go anywhere. So we're starting to pick that back up and start all over again with our piece.
Yeah, I think, what we're finding is we need to link arms with other entities out there and create a force that is undeniable. That's where we're gonna see this because 'cause I've been guilty of this, going after things onesie twosies from my foxhole. We gotta bring everybody together and create an overwhelming force along with the VSOs to get the attention of Congress, get the attention because, I was on 60 Minutes, as you know, beginning of the summer. That, again, was a tremendous platform, the 15, 16 minutes to help inform folks is exactly what we were talking about. But it's that type of pressure that we need to put on Congress and onto the departments to move the ball. Unfortunately, right now, and you alluded to this, we're into this construct of leadership. I call it leadership by lawyer. We have leaders that are not making any decisions without the freaking lawyer standing next to them. And to me, that is so disabling. So just it's a vulnerability that's going to come back to haunt us. And I think that to your point, when I have conversations with veterans or warriors that are struggling, and I explain what we've just been talking about, and I say to them, you're not crazy. You very well may be injured because of this. You should see the sea change that comes across their face
Closure.
because every one of them remembers what it's like to be on that freaking range or to be rocked by an explosion or whatever, where that energy wave, that invisible wave has passed through their brain. And now, as we're starting to understand, creating these little micro tears into the circuitry of the brain that create the challenges that very well, I think, explain why it's so difficult for these folks to kind of, you know, you know, remember things, to be able to put, certain tasks together, to some level of organization through their day, to be able to deal with the thoughts that they have and so forth. This, to me, once you see where the damage is occurring in the brain, it explains a lot as far as the projections or the manifestations we're seeing in a lot of these operators and these folks that have been subjected to this. It's like, but I think that the department right now is looking at this like a Pandora's box. Boy, we don't want to open this thing up. It's
Mhm.
following the same course as Agent Orange, Gulf War Syndrome, burn pits,
Yep.
directed energy. Hey, they know there's something there, but the body of evidence is building. And my counsel to the Department of Defense is, look, I'm not looking here to put a big old chest wound. I'm here to help you. Let's hit this head on because the more that we disregard this, the more that we ignore this and stick our head in the sand, the more it's potentially going to affect our readiness, especially as we're entering into this modern warfare construct, where we're just seeing, this digital age, the issues with the drones, as you have alluded to. The speed of innovation on a battlefield is unprecedented. And if we cannot preserve that human brain, that command and control center, that is truly what I think makes the difference. It's not the technology; it's that human brain ability to adapt. That's the focus of this. And unfortunately, you had to lose your son. I had to lose my son. We've had to lose a lot of men and women. Um, 7, 8x to suicide over those killed in action and OIF and OEF, 7 to 8x, and that's probably undercounted, way undercounted.
Way undercounted.
Why isn't this an absolute priority within our society, within our military ecosystem and our VA system? This is at epidemic levels, and I'm trying to take the emotion out of this because as a leader, a former leader in the department, I see this as something that's really going to come back to haunt us unless we hit this head on and figure this out. Like I said earlier, let's figure this out and get ahead of it.
And we have to. And like to your point, Frank, I mean, we don't want this to be burn pitch. We have this big bag of cash for the lawyers to go after. Every person I talked to that's been harmed by this, and when I can't even say harmed, that's been impacted because harm means that, they really weren't, they knew about it and they got hurt. No, they've been impacted. All they want is peace. They want treatment. And if they get disability, great, they deserve that right? But nobody's looking for a big settlement with the United States government. Nobody wants that. Not even the men and women want that. They want help, and they're not getting it, and they're not getting treated. And then they become part of that problem that you talked about, where we've got them leaving us because there's no other option for them. And they're in these holes right now, and it's so hopeless. They call up organizations and they don't support psychedelic treatments, and there's 38,000 organizations out here talking about linking together, right? You got 38,000 organizations, VSOs out here that are trying to help. And yet, 90% of them don't even know if this is an issue, right? And so they're getting these mentally ill folks. They're putting them on horses. They're taking them diving. Great, man. That's all good. But until we touch this, we're not going to make a diff. And it's yeah, I mean, that's to your point about whether it's the VA, whether it's HHS, whether it's, the Department of War, it doesn't matter. This is not something to run from. We've got to face this head on because this is going to continue to impact. You talked about an existential threat to our security. What if everybody looked at these jobs going, I'm not doing that. That's not going to bust my brain. All right. I mean, I stood up in front of SOCOM and I told them all straight to my face. I said, look, when I put on that funny green hat, it was because I knew I was going to get dinged up. I knew that I was jumping, I was blowing things up, I was running. I was going to leave the military with a significant impact of pain for all the fun that I had, and I'd do it all over again, but the VA was going to take care of me. Now we have an issue that I didn't know about, that I was dinged up pretty bad. That after 9/11, it got even worse. And now the VA is not there for our vets, and we have to fix that because and that's the whole problem. That's the whole good thing about it, is that if the VA is going to have these programs in the military just imagine if you had an HBOT chamber at the Union, you go put your head in it, whatever, right? And we're treating the brain, we're minimizing the impact. You're not a range safety officer for 3 years anymore. You're not a SWIC boat guy for 10 years anymore. 3 years and you're gone. Your brain's had enough, right? And we start making all these changes, and then the VA's got programs to take care of whatever residual impact we have. Man, who's not going to want to continue being a Green Beret or Navy SEAL, all this other stuff, right? Because we're going to be able to help. And that's where I think, we have to dive into this more, and not just dive into it more. We to your point, we need a focused, just what do you want to call it, a task force, a coalition, of just a large amount of people hitting that hill and letting people know that we cannot turn our back on our veterans like this. And you can't just chuck money at it. They just doubled the size of the Fox grant right now. We have put, I don't even know how many billions of dollars against this issue of just mental health and suicide. And we have had no decrease in the rate for years. And so what does that tell us? We're doing it wrong. So let's get outside this paradigm. Let's have a shift, whatever you will call it. Let's just blow it up. It don't work. So let's just detonate it, man. Let's slap a bunch of charges on it. Let's blow the whole thing up, and let's start fresh with some common sense based on research and science and the fact that we know that our boys and girls are suffering, and let's address it. Let's just not chuck money at the same problem. And just because more money doesn't mean better outcomes. And it's just nuts. And so, yeah, I'll get off my soapbox.
I'll close out with this. So for your listeners, Dr. Jana Mosseri-Brooks wrote a paper that talked about the issuance of the Purple Heart to those individuals that could demonstrate that they had, a brain injury, blast injury.
Like that.
And how it could reduce suicides. And when you read this, and she talks about institutional betrayal and so forth, it's very illuminating paper. It's one that, and I'm not playing down or minimizing or trivializing the Purple Heart, but why wouldn't we recognize those men and women that have been injured in combat with this invisible wound and qualify for them that they have been injured and they're not crazy?
Well, I mean, Frank, what's the difference between a bullet wound to the arm and physiological damage to the brain? Damage is damage.
Damage, right.
And I mean, granted, some of it, most of it maybe could have occurred during training for whatever, but you cannot negate the impact of incoming rounds and outgoing rounds and explosions on that brain, to a point where, and to your point, given these men and women the validation of their injury as a result of it, it's got to be documented. It's got to be validated. Nobody's just going to, you were in Iraq, you're in a Purple Heart. Nobody would be saying that. But I do agree with that approach to, giving them some kind of just an incentive to stay around, and
To restore their dignity,
dignity. Yeah, good point.
something that they could point at. What would this cost the department? Nothing.
Okay. Yeah, and Frank, to your point too, is the good thing about when you see that look in their faces is because now you've given them a mission. You mean my brain? I got to heal this. All right, this is what I'm going to do, and
That's
here's a
right.
whole book on how to do it. So, look, as we close out, Frank, tell the folks how they find you, how they get a hold of you. Please bring up the 60-minute special so they can go ahead and look for that. And then, anything else you got going on in the brain health or Frank Larkin space, I don't care, man. Talk about yourself.
Yeah, just go ahead and go to warriorcall.org. This is a national movement that we have going on with other VSOs, simply to make call to somebody that served in uniform. Take a call from them and have an honest conversation. And if you sense that, hey, something's not right, get them connected up with resources. The big part of that is just to let them know they're not alone, that people care, and that there is hope. So if you go to that website, you'll see my contact information. You'll see the link to 60 Minutes, which will kind of fill this in. And then if you Google my name on the internet, there's a lot of, stuff out there. Hopefully it helps.
With that bio, there better be.
Well, hey, it's not about me, but Bruce, you and
I
I
know. Yeah.
lock arms to try to make a difference so for those that come behind us don't have to walk the same path of pain. That's what it's about. Just remember, folks, you very well may be hurt. You're not crazy. Let's, stay with us, help us figure this out. Um, there is a way forward.
Yeah, we love you, man. All right. Well, Frank, thank you
Love
so
you
much
too.
for coming on the show, man. Sending our love to you. I'll be praying for you and your journey. And we are linking arms. I'm going to be with you. I'll give you a call next week. Let's figure out what you're doing, what I'm doing, and let's go kick some doors down on the hill, man. I'm all about it.
Well, there's nobody better than a sergeant major to kick ass, so I'm right there with you, brother.
All right, bro.
Thank you.
All right. God bless you, man. See you in a bit. Folks, another amazing episode of Broken Brains. Remember, if you know anybody that's hurting, if you're to help, if you yourself are suffering, as Frank said, reach out for help. You do not have to suffer in science. And when it comes down to repetitive brain trauma, there is hope, there are treatments, and we can help you. So reach out to us, anybody you know, and we will do everything we can in our powers to put you on a path to health and betterment. If you're interested to know more about this, go to our website, free book. I wrote it. Please get it. 88 pages. Become informed on the issue of repetitive brain trauma, repetitive head impact. The new book will have a chapter on veterans on repetitive blast exposure, and we are working on some articles for that as well. Don't forget our app on the Google and Apple Store, Head Smart. Get it. The only concussion app, repetitive head impact on it. If you like this episode, please follow us on Instagram at Broken Brains Podcast or subscribe to us on YouTube at Broken Brains with Bruce Parkman. And if you can, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, because it helps us get the word out. And the more people that are aware of this, the more that like Frank and I, can get the change we need to help our veterans, help our athletes, and take care of this issue, because it doesn't actually have to be an issue. And then over time, it will not. Thank you so much. We'll see you again. Remember, you only have one melon. Take care of it. God bless you all. And thanks again for listening to another episode of Broken Brains with your host, Bruce Parkman. Take care.